Thanks again for coming. My name is Marjaan. So before we get started, we're going to go over norms again, how we interact in this space with one another, which we want to make sure that people are drawing connections to how we interact. At the memorial site on East 38th Street, we talked a little bit about it last week. We'll say some more today. But also making those same connections on how we interact with one another here in the community, with our neighbors, right? And if you can't make those connections, again, your black neighbors will draw them out for you. They will spell it out for you. My block, we met yesterday, and our block meetings, I know some folks haven't done that yet, but we want to keep encouraging folks to get that started. If you haven't done it this past week, let's make sure that we start doing that this upcoming week, because that's where the real work is gonna get done. You know, obviously there's a lot of information and a lot of stuff said in this big group, and we can't unpack it all, and that's not the goal today, is to unpack it all. It's for you to hear what needs to be said, for us to break up into small groups, and then for y'all to keep those small group conversations going in the community. And as you know, we've been doing this for years. We've been doing this for here in the Bryant neighborhood. I've been doing it for 6 or 7 years, and folks have been doing it a lot longer than me. And this isn't uncommon, right? A community that's 75%, at least in 2010, community that was over 70% folks of color. Every community meeting we have, it's usually over 80% white folks, right? Black and brown neighbors don't feel comfortable showing up in these spaces, so we got to figure out why that is, right? It's hard for us to say, listen to your black neighbors, when black neighbors don't want to show up for this kind of stuff. And, you know, it's, again, we're not pointing the finger at anybody. Like, I get why black folks don't want to show up. I didn't want to show up to this kind of stuff either, truth be told, right? I had to do it eventually when I felt that this community was being gentrified. That's when I started to show up. A lot of y'all didn't want to show up, but after George Floyd was murdered, you said, fuck, we got to do it, right? So whatever brought you here, that's cool. Let's keep it going. Let's keep you coming. The goal is to pull people in. We're not trying to push people out, right? We got to build community together. So let's unpack these norms real quick, and then we'll jump right into the agenda.
So when it comes to one of the things that we are known for here at Bryant Neighborhood Organization is what we call group norms. And so what we're talking about is, so with some examples, and I'll get a couple of people to shout some out too, but one of the things is that we want to have what we call agreements. Some people call them group norms. You might have heard of it before, but we want to make sure that we have some things that are in the air as you're going into your groups, that you're remembering those things as you're going in. So a good example of a group norm, so some of the ones that we have here at Bryant Neighborhood Organization are respect. Another one is step up, step back. So if you're the type person that talks all the time, but you see somebody in the group that isn't talking, then you step up, step back. Another thing about that is that if you just so happen to have a person of color or an indigenous person in your group, you know, you let that person step up, because a lot of times we don't often get heard in these small groups. So let them speak, or make sure that you're hearing their truth, because a lot of times our truth doesn't come out, just like our history, or her story for that matter. So step up, step back, respect, making sure that you know, we're actually listening to people's intentions versus judging folks. There's a lot of things that actually those are a couple of some of those agreements. So are there any agreements that people want to lift up right now, or group norms that they would like to see in their group? And just shout it out. Speak your truth.
Don't depersonalize it.
Depersonalize it. No interrupting. Any others? And we're going to be building off of these, and there'll probably be a little sheet of paper that we'll have at the next assembly. Any others? Say that a little louder. Avoid blame when possible.
And I would add, avoid assigning personal blame. There is a lot of systemic blamed it. Let's not avoid that, right? Power created this crisis. Let's name that.
Right. Any others? Okay, so we heard those, and we're good with those. So with those being said, raise your hand if you're good with those. Okay. I know there's some that are spontaneously going to come out in the groups as well. So, yeah, okay. So we're good there. So we have a lot of, there's going to be a number of things that are going to come up in the groups as well. And so we want to make sure that, and this is something else we're going to have as a handout as well. You know, we have some definitions that we want to continue to keep talking about. And as you know, in this work, a lot of times there are terms that come up. Gentrification, which is on the agenda, that comes up. Displacement. You know, a lot of these terms are coming up, and we want to make sure that we have some solid definitions on that. And that's something that we're going to be passing out, because we have those over at B&O. We have those solid definitions of what that is. So, when it comes to racism, it's that issue of race plus privilege equals racism. So we work with a group called the People. Power plus prejudice equals racism. So we have some of those terms at B&O. We work with a group called the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. And so we're going to continuously talk about those terms that are going to keep coming up, so we can make sure that, you know, one of the things that, another one that comes up a lot is when it comes to African Americans, people of color, indigenous people, there's internalized racial oppression. When you're dealing with white people, and you have internalized racial superiority. Other terms that keep coming up. So we want to make sure we delve into those terms very deeply, and we're going to be talking about those as we're going through the history. So, all right, I'm going to pass it over. Thank you.
And I just want to add one last point on when we're talking about people of color, black folks, indigenous folks, Latinos, brown folks, Asian folks. It's also important that we don't conflate these groups. I've seen this a lot, and it actually contributes to racism, this divide and conquer. When I see white folks that want to cozy up to moderate black or brown people or people of color to push people who have more radical ideas to the margins, right? And they want to wrap themselves around around people of color, brown or black people who agree with them and who are not here to call out gentrification and white supremacy. That's problematic. Or when I see businesses putting up signs on their building that says black owned, and it's a damn lie, because black people hardly own anything in this town, right? It might be immigrant owned. It might be white owned that leases space to black businesses, but it ain't black owned, right? So saying that it is racist as hell, when a lot of these same immigrant businesses are anti-black, right? So if you find yourself doing this, stop it. And we'll unpack that over time, and we'll go deeper in these trainings, right? But it's been a major source of tension in this community, right? So with that said, we're going to jump into the history. So today we're going to talk about some of the modern history. So I told y'all last week I moved here in 2007. So I've been here 13 years, and I know a lot of folks here born and raised in this community. Raise your hand if you were born and raised in this community, or if you spent the majority of your life growing up here. All right. So a lot of y'all folks. So we're gonna. So today, Sandra was supposed to be here, Sandra Richardson, but she pulled her back. So let's send some good energy to her. But next Saturday, our goal is to get folks, black folks who were born and raised in this community, to share some of the history, right? Again, I'm learning the history as I lived here for 13 years. I'm a history teacher, and that's one of my goals, is to share information as I learn it. So I was amazed when I moved into this community about the rich history, the hidden history of this community. I grew up listening to Prince, Sounds of Blackness, Morris Day and the Times, and then when I when I lived here. It was a few years before I realized that this was their community when they started making that music, when they started forming those bands, and they started that sound called the Minneapolis Sound, right? And it wasn't until about 2011 when I really started to notice the changes in this community. And the community I very intentionally moved into, a black community, was those principles of wanting to be around black folks, around folks who aren't going to judge me or call the police on me, it started to change. And it made me feel unsafe in my own community. And I know that a lot of white folks, that's pretty shocking and surprising when I say that to white folks, that I don't feel safe living in a community with a lot of white folks, right? And what we've all been programmed to believe is the exact opposite. Even black folks are not supposed to feel safe living in a community with black folks. White equals safety in a white supremacist society, right? So, as the community started to change, people were very reactionary, and we were organizing, just like what's happening now, right? And a lot of the stuff, so one of the first things we did was we started listening to folks, right? And listening to people in this community and also working in the nonprofit sector in Minneapolis, I got to know so many different sides of how the city operates, right? I got to hear from people in the community, but I also got to see the nonprofit social service agencies work. I got to see the inner workings of the city of Minneapolis, the corporations like Target that really own this town, and the politicians and the police and how they respond, right? And how it all works together. And so people outside of this state, they think the Twin Cities is some progressive bastion, right? Of forward thinkers and progressive politics and folks who are ahead of civil rights movement. Like, this has been the narrative since Hubert Humphrey for, 80 years, right? But if you talk to black folks, we're living in two different worlds. I grew up in the suburbs with open racism, violent racism. I moved to Minneapolis. Living in the Bryant neighborhood is the longest place I've ever lived for at one time. 13 years, that's the longest place I've ever been. And I realized pretty quickly that racism was very different in the city, but this city is racist as hell. But not because my neighbors are gonna call me nigger, even though that happened too, right? But it's because of the poverty that exists in black and brown communities that is adjacent to extreme wealth. And we live right next to each other in segregated communities, and the black and brown people go to work to serve the needs of white people, to bag your groceries, right? Or to work at your malls, or to serve your fast food, or to cook it in the restaurant, right? We don't even get the jobs of servers, right? We're in the kitchen. So I started to notice as Nicollet started to get gentrified in the early 2000s. 38th and Nicollet happened a long time ago, and then we started to see it spread down Nicollet, right? So we started to see some establishments that many of us love and like to frequent, like Pat's Tap, Ola Arepa, who are owned by some problematic business owners, right? People who, again, don't hire black or brown people in the front of the house, but have no problem sticking black or brown people in the back of the house, right? How is this all interconnected? Well, if you starve the people that work for you, and then you move into their community, and when you show up, it's hard for you to look at these same people in the eye, ask them how their day was, or get to know them. That's the problem right there, right? So after we met last Sunday here, there was a call to the community about how people are showing up at the memorial. So some white folks got together under the leadership of Carmen Means, the director of the Bryant Central Neighborhood Organization, and they put together some flyers and some language around some norms of how to show up, right? Because it was problematic. A lot of folks, a lot of folks are right here in this community, live here on the south side, that are visiting the memorial, and a lot of folks are coming from outside the community, outside the city, from the suburbs. Some people from out of state, right? And again, there's nothing wrong with tourism, right? Tourism's gonna happen all the time, even in a time of crisis. But it's about how we show up. So if you show up at the memorial and you can't even look at black folks in the eye or speak to folks, I'm gonna bet you do the same in your neighborhood. I'm gonna assume that until you prove me wrong. So, I want to go back to working in nonprofits. So again, I was having these conversations a decade ago with some of my coworkers at an organization that we worked at that served homeless youth. And immediately when I started working here, I realized, well, damn, almost everybody we serve are black. And almost everybody that worked there was white. It was me and one other black staff that were new hires. And I started having these conversations with my white peers about many of them getting their first job out of college, coming from white communities outside of Minneapolis, going to college in white communities. And then their first real experience with black and brown people is at the job site, where they have power over these folks that they're serving, right? And then when they punch out the clock, they're retreating right back to their white community. Do you understand how these dynamics are problematic? Has anybody, raise your hand if you've thought about this before today. Raise your hand if you work or have worked in the social service sector. Good. I'm glad this isn't new for a lot of y'all, right? But for some of y'all, raise your hand if this is new, if you've never thought about this. That's okay too. Like, as I talk to people, I'm always hearing from white folks like, damn, I have never thought about that. You shouldn't be embarrassed. This is a place for honesty. So, those were some difficult conversations that I was having with my colleagues, and those were difficult conversations we're having in this community. And of course, I was the angry black guy for bringing it up, right? But at this very same time, I was trying to make these connections with folks that, okay, we have a job to do to serve people, to help provide basic need services to homeless youth. But if we're not addressing the source of this issue, why is 90% of the folks showing up here black, and why is 95% of the folks working here white? If we're not addressing that issue, then it's a Band-Aid service and it's BS. People didn't like when I started to be challenging that. They said that we have a lane to stay in. We're not here to change the world. Clearly, they weren't there to change the world or to even change the city. They were not in the business of ending homelessness. It was in the business of profiting off of homelessness. And those are two very different things. Because if we're going to end homelessness, that means we got to end racism and racial capitalism. Because poverty and homelessness was created. This was all made. This was all manufactured. And if you don't understand that, you'll get to understand that as we go through these assemblies and when we start our training in a few weeks. We haven't scheduled yet. So, around 2010, R.T. Ryback, he was still mayor. He was a 3-term mayor. And towards the end, this is the height of the recession, and this is the height of the Occupy Homes movement. So we had a foreclosure crisis. So it's the end of the first decade of the 2000s. And RT was pushing this, he thought it was a brilliant idea, to grow the city. Y'all know about that campaign? Maybe it was a little over a decade, but it was the goal, we're still in it, right? The goal was to grow the city by 100,000 people, to grow the tax base so we can pay for the inequities. So this is around the time when community leaders, black folks, were starting to pull the wool, off of these inequities. And at the same time, the narrative was being distributed around the country that Minneapolis is the best place to live in the nation. Black folks, we added the caveat, if you're white. Because if you're black, it's actually the worst place. And it took a few more years of research and activism to start to document it, but I think we all know now, Minneapolis, not just us, but the world knows now, Minneapolis is one of the worst places to live if you're black, if you're native, if you're a person of color, but especially if you're black, right? So, some of us saw right through what was happening, the city wanting to grow its tax base by 100,000 people, because this came at the same time. We knew our communities were changing, and this wasn't natural evolution, right? When people are being displaced and people are being moved in, those aren't natural changes. Those are changes dictated by public policy and wealthy developers. And if you don't have power within the system, then you are subject to it. You will be displaced. So black folks, of course, represent the disproportionate amount of people affected by these systems, but it can happen to white folks too. If you're poor and you're white, and you don't have as much power within the system, you will also be displaced. And it's very important that we understand that. It's very important that we understand that black folks, we don't have the privilege of being moderate, right? Because our goddamn life is dependent on it. Excuse my language, y'all. But when it's life or death, some things don't seem so radical. Now we're at a time where white folks are starting to realize, well, damn, my life depends on this too, right? When folks thought that the mob was going to come burn down this community, folks were like, we got to do something. I want y'all to know there's no mob coming to burn down this community other than the police, other than the politicians, other than the people who created this crisis. They've been burning down this community for a long time, but only certain people have been feeling the flames. The rest of y'all have been protected from it. So, we knew the city was pushing gentrification. It was coming from the top down. When they say we're going to grow the city by 100,000 people, who are they recruiting to move to Minneapolis? Y'all saw the commercials. Minneapolis, Minnesota. I think I spotted one black person on all the commercials I saw of the tourist Minnesota commercials. Or if you even get online and you look at the city of Minneapolis campaigns when they're recruiting folks to move to the city. I mean, let's talk about it, right? So let's go back 10 years. We had a brewery boom. Who remembers the brewery boom? Some of y'all were excited about it. Some of us were like, this is the whitest shit I've ever seen. Yep. And now we realize, I think most of us realize a brewery boom is not going to save our economy or our city, right? It was just a way to create more spaces for white professionals so out-of-towners can say, hey, look what we got in Minnesota. Y'all like Austin? Well, we're going to create that here. Y'all like Seattle? Y'all like Portland? We're going to create that in Minneapolis. And we want you to come to this city. Again, who are they talking to? Are they talking to poor black people in Chicago? Is that who they're trying to get to move to Minneapolis? Are they trying to get poor brown folks? Are they trying to get poor anybody? Hell no. Their goal is to fix the poor problem. And if poverty is synonymous with being black or being brown or being Native American, then goddamn it, we got a problem. And we got to untangle this. So, a lot of us fell for this whole campaign. We got to grow the city. We got to rob Peter to pay Paul to address these inequities in the city. But a lot of folks immediately saw through it, and we started organizing to fight back immediately. And it was messy. But this all connects to, so some of y'all maybe didn't hear about the city's campaign to grow the population, but you definitely heard about concentration, how we grow the population through building up. Everybody heard that, right? This was, what, about 2 years ago? A huge battle between homeowners and renters, NIMBY folks, and folks who are less protective, right? And they wanted to confuse us to make us think that it was a clear-cut battle between folks who own homes and folks who rent, but it wasn't at all, right? I'm not a NIMBY person. I'm not white. I did not grow up in a home that we owned. I grew up in low-income housing that we rented. So I was the people that the NIMBY folks were trying to keep out of the community my whole life, right? Yep. So, but people were confused when I said I was against concentration. They were confused. But anybody who knew me would know, duh. We've been fighting in this community against displacement. Concentration, as we're moving folks into the city, what's going to happen with a lot of those existing communities? Well, we got to make room. So if nobody is being dragged out of their apartment that they paid rent on, but if you miss rent because you work in a low-wage job or you've been trapped in poverty, well, goddamn it, the law gives the green light to the sheriff to remove your whole family. So these systems work together. They conspire together, right? We're not talking about conspiracy theories. We're talking about real-life conspiracies of systems that work together. So, So that led us to 2012, and I mentioned it last week, but I'm gonna talk a little bit more in depth about it. But 2012 things. So this idea of gentrification and who owns the community and how do we begin to revive this community started to come to a head. So 38th in Chicago has been a long battled intersection between folks who live here, long-term residents and newcomers, between developers, white wealthy folks, and black folks who own very little in this community. Most people agreed that something needed to be done, that there was a problem on 38th in Chicago. Nobody was a fan of the shooting. Nobody was a fan of the police terrorizing black youth. Nobody was a fan of youth fighting one another. But we fundamentally disagreed on how the problem was created and how to address it. So the idea was to get a grocery store, an affordable grocery store on 38th in Chicago. Black folks were fighting for that for decades after a lot of the grocery stores moved out of this community. So that idea turned into a co-op, and we all know co-ops are not affordable. And it moved from 38th in Chicago to 38th and 3rd. And so there was an online Seward Co-op watchdog group called At the Roots, and it was by a few neighbors here in Bryant and Central. And so Isaac Martin and Laura Getch were two folks who started up the website, and they quickly recruited folks like Art Seratoff, Sandra Richardson, Deborah Ramos, myself, and others. And we started they started door knocking before I did. They pulled me into it. I joined them. We hosted 2 barbecues in the community. And immediately, the feedback we heard was black folks, working class white folks, brown folks were very critical or just straight up against the co-op. White folks, black professionals were very excited for this grocery store. And what we discovered was it moved from 38th and Chicago to 38th and 3rd. And that this community was labeled a food desert, meaning there's not an affordable grocery store in, what, a mile, 2 miles, something like that? Yep. And it had something to do with income and demographics too, right? So that made the land in our community, it opened up an opportunity. So what we found out was the co-op, they received tax credits from building that grocery store here on East 38th Street versus West 38th Street. But what we immediately realized was they weren't building that grocery store for the people in this community, at least not the majority of people in this community who can't even afford to shop there. And what we also realized was the sewer co-op that's on Franklin, that's been there for 40 plus years, employed 85% white staff in a community that was only 50% white. So we said, hell no, you're not moving to this community like that. So if you show up in this community, you are going to employ 80% people of color. And they said, well, let's negotiate. They said, how about 35? I swear. They said, how about we employ 35% people of color by 2020? Something like that. I swear to God. I think they bragged about employing 16% people of color. I said, if that ain't the most racist thing, y'all. So there was a big fight with the co-op. And the narrative became, these people are against a co-op. These people don't understand the radical politics behind a co-op, right? And that wasn't it at all. Like, I'm not against co-ops. The idea of a co-op is a great idea. But we immediately said, a co-op that franchises and builds in another community, can it really be called a co-op? Isn't the idea of a co-op homegrown from a community? So we said, if this co-op's going to be here, it should be the Bryant and Central Co-op, and we should take over. They didn't like that idea, of course, because it wasn't about feeding this community, it was about profits. Let's be real. And so we knew that the majority of the base for the store was in Kingfield. That was their ideal clientele on the other side of the freeway, or in Field on the other side of 46th Street, or in Bancroft on the other side of Chicago. So these streets I just named are markers. Chicago, 46th Street, 35W. They were markers that determined where black people could live about 60 years ago. So to this day, if you go on that side of Chicago, it's 80% white or more. This is 80% people of color. On the other side of the freeway, 85% white. Field, 80% white. Regina, which used to be a part of the historic Black South Side, is now close to 80% white. Just in 13 years since I lived here, it changed dramatically. So what does that say? It says that black folks are being priced out of their own community, and the folks who can afford to live here are not originally from here and know very little about the community. So the sewer co-op, that whole campaign, like I said, there was a lot of tension. If we can do it over, we'd do it very differently, right? But we were kind of thrusted into that struggle because we were reacting to something. But what we didn't do is we did not sufficiently build a base of community supporters who were on our team, because we didn't have a whole lot of time to do the struggle. But what we did afterwards, after it was over, and you know, we won some small victories. If it wasn't for us pushing, you wouldn't see black folks working at that store. I think when they opened, it was like 60% folks of color with majority black folks. So they wouldn't have done that if we didn't force them to do it, right? So there were some concessions. We started to talk about paying their workers $15 an hour as well as unionizing. And when our campaign kind of ended, the workers took on that struggle from there, and guess what? They have a union now. And the sewer co-op, very quickly after opening, committed to paying their workers $15 an hour, even though, of course, by the time that actually gets implemented, people are going to need $20 an hour. But that's capitalism, right? So what we did afterwards was we started taking over neighborhood organizations, Bryant Central, and we realized we have to build a base. We have to get our neighbors out. We have to build community. We got to get folks talking to each other. All this work can't be on the shoulders of black folks or Latinos. White folks have to do this work. White people have to teach other white people how not to be racist. If I got to teach my neighbors how to treat black people and how to treat me like a human, man, y'all gonna have to send me your paychecks. That's not a burden I signed up for. I intentionally moved into a black community so I didn't have to do that. But goddamn it, look what followed me, right? So, before we get into small groups, I want to make some of these connections real quick. I want to spell it out one more time. Because what we're hearing here in the big group, or from the speakers, again, it's a lot to process, and you're not going to process it all in the small groups. So we want you to take the small groups back to your block. So if you didn't do that last week, hopefully this upcoming week, folks will get these block groups going and talk about this in your block groups. And within your blocks, break up into pairs. You know, let's do pair and share. You know, what are some of the most powerful stuff you heard that you need to unpack more? And we know you're going to go home and unpack it with your family too, hopefully. Obviously, right? But again, this is not about assigning personal blame to any individuals. But we have to acknowledge something is fundamentally broken in a society where you need a black man to be publicly executed and half a city to be burnt down before people are listened to. Something is fundamentally broken with society, with community. In the city of Minneapolis, in the state of Minnesota, and in the United States, and it has always been this way. This did not start on May 25th when George Floyd was murdered. And if you think it did, I'm glad you're here, because we have a lot to teach you. Now, before we get into small groups, I just want to end by talking about power. And everybody who knows me knows I don't mince words. I'm not afraid to call out politicians. R.T. Ryback, if I was to place the blame, and I know we said we're not going to place individual blame, but these politicians are not, we're not addressing them as individuals, as people. They are the face of power. Even though R.T. Ryback is out of office, he is still the face of power. He runs the Minneapolis Foundation that they give away millions of dollars to organizations, and it's very problematic in the process of who gets that money. He still has a lot of power. I saw this man on CNN last week still standing behind the police, still preaching reform. He needs to be muted and dethroned from any decision making in this town. Elizabeth Clinton, hey, my sister used to work for her. I think she's a nice person personally. We disagreed almost on everything politically. Andrea Jenkins lives right there. She is the council member right now. My sister works for her. She was part of this, supposedly this progressive council that is in office right now, that through public policy, they reinforce that black lives don't matter. That black lives only matter 1/100th of white lives. Let me remind you, last year in 2019, the city of Minneapolis unanimously decided to award Justine Damon, who was murdered by a Minneapolis police officer, $20 million. And the same city council awarded the family of Jamar Clark, who was murdered by the Minneapolis Police Department, $100,000. Before George Floyd's lynching, if you could not say Jamar Clark was murdered by the police, we have a problem. In 2013, a young brother named Mookie, Terrence Franklin, was also murdered by the Minneapolis police. Youth that I worked with knew him intimately. They were cases of police murder in this city that I got involved in. And it was because of the person who I worked with did. And he was that he was burglarizing a store or something. Police chased him into a home where he was running from. It wasn't his home, so it was a break-in, but he was running and hiding. They sent a police dog in there to attack him in the basement, and then after that, they murdered him. These are police with like machine guns. And these politicians rubber stamped the police narrative that said he went for their gun. Didn't they say that about Jamar Clark? What do you think they would have said about George Floyd if it wasn't on video? Again, too many people I know that I've worked with, white folks that I've been in relationship with, quickly rubber stamp the police narrative. Why? Because if they challenged it, it pokes holes in everything you believe in. Everything you believe in, that the police lie, that the police terrorize black people. The politicians lie, and they hire the police to terrorize black people to keep racial poverty going, to keep transferring wealth from our black bodies and our black communities into white communities. If you don't see it that way, we're going to keep spelling it out for you. Police are here to enforce racial poverty, not to create public safety. If you think that's radical to say that, we live in two different worlds. And the people that told you I'm radical have been gaslighting your ass. They have been gaslighting you. The Bill Cosbys and the Colin Powells out here have been gaslighting you, teaching and preaching black civility. Guess what, y'all? Black people are angry as hell, and we always have been. So anybody that tells y'all that black people should be talking nice, or they should be presenting like Bill Cosby, they're lying to you to make you feel safe. We have to be done with making white people feel safe. Because it's not safe. It's not safe for you. If you continue to treat people the way that George Floyd was treated, well, goddamn it, you should be scared of black people. If you ain't gonna do nothing about it, you should be scared. And that's what this is about. Why do we show up in these communities the way we do? Because we've all been taught to fear black people, including black people. Why have we been taught to fear black people? Let's unpack 400 years of history and see what y'all did to black people. Yeah, I'd be afraid too. If I treated somebody like that for 400 years and then I denied that I treated them that way and there was no reconciliation, I'd be afraid that they're gonna come murder my ass in my sleep. But guess what? It don't have to be that way. Reconciliation starts right here. But you have to know it's broken before we can start the repair. So, if this makes you uncomfortable, good. Lean into it. If you're afraid of black people, it's not too late for you. Right? What's the term they say? Only Jesus could save us. something like I'm messing this up, but George Floyd is going to save us, y'all. So I'm going to pass it back to Malik before we get into, he's going to break us up into groups, but before we do that, y'all, we got to say his name. Why are we here, y'all?
George Floyd.
Say his name!
George Floyd!
Louder!
George Floyd!
Say his name, y'all.
George Floyd!
Who brought us here, y'all?
George Floyd!
Rest in peace, George Floyd.
Thank you. All right, so we're going to break up into small groups. We've got some small group questions here. We're going to pass out the sign-up sheets in the small groups as well. Make sure you sign up on them. Again, we're transitioning into a new society and a new world, and we're actually, as the brother said a few minutes ago, the reconciliation starts here, and we got to keep this momentum going, especially for those who've been ignored for so long, for the last 400 years and beyond. So if there are BIPOC folks, black people, indigenous people, people of color that are in your groups, hear them speak. We have group facilitators that are here right now. If there isn't an apparent group facilitator that's here, somebody volunteer to be that group facilitator and to go through the questions.
Let's call up facilitators. Anybody
It's a good idea.
who's been asked to come here to just kind of help out, can we get you up here, up front? Waleed, Art? Anybody else?
Come to the front.
Okay. So we got 2 additional facilitators for any group that might need one. Otherwise, they can just kind of float around as well.
Sounds good. So huddle up, and then what we have here is we have stakes for each of the avenues. So we got Chicago, we got 3rd, we got Oakland. If your stake is up here, grab your stake, move it over into the circle, place your stake, and then start with the questions. And then we're going to give about 40 minutes for this. And, you know, say who you are, say your address, how you're showing up, race, gender pronouns, ethnicity, class, how long you've lived in Bryant, what have you done to prevent this crisis, how have you created this crisis, how have you responded to this crisis, what have you heard from your black neighbors? So those are some of the questions that are there. So come up, grab your stake, and huddle up.
Hey, real quick, for some of y'all, you might think this, it seems just like last Sunday. It's intentional, right? The goal is to build on it. A lot of folks, those questions that we asked last week were brand new, so some of y'all couldn't fully answer them. Today, we hope we can answer them a little better. Next week, we'll probably add questions rather than changing them, and just keep adding questions onto it. So some of y'all weren't here last week, great. Some of y'all are inviting your neighbors to join us, keep doing that. But we're gonna keep addressing some of the similar themes, and it's very intentional.
All right, let's break up, grab your stake.